Trump megadonor Sheldon Adelson, who directly participated in the persecution of Julian Assange and advocated dropping a nuclear bomb on Iran, has died. I'll show you some clips from a previous video which actually focused on Bolton, but showed the relationship between Adelson and Trump and Adelson and Bolton. During the campaign, Trump also talked about how he supposedly was self-funding, how he didn't want anybody's money. And Trump also said that when Sheldon Adelson gives money to a politician, Sheldon Adelson has total control over that politician.
I know why you're not going to support me. And, you're not going to support me because I don't want your money.
Special interests and lobbyists. And they're all cheering on their candidate because their candidates will do whatever they want them to do. I'm self-funding my campaign. I'm putting up my own money.
And by the way, I'm a self-funder.
Donald Trump's view on how Sheldon Adelson's giving works back in 2016 about the candidate you work for, Marco Rubio. Take a listen.
I like Sheldon a lot. He's been a person that I've known over the years. We have a very good relationship. And I'm self-funding. I don't want anybody's money. But if Sheldon gives to him, he'll have total control over Rubio. And that's the problem with the way the system works.
Seems kind of accurate.
Casino mogul Sheldon Adelson. He's worth an estimated $30 billion.
One of the biggest donors to Trump's presidential campaign.
Not only did his company notch a first quarter windfall of $670 million as a result of the massive Republican tax cut, he also scored big in his foreign policy interests. Trump scuttled the Iran deal as he hoped that he would, and is going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, also a big Adelson priority.
On behalf of the 45th President of the United States on America, we welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem.
Does it convince you now that he's seen something significant to change his mind?
What Trump has seen is a significant amount of Sheldon Adelson's money. And what Trump has done is put John Bolton in one of the most powerful positions because Sheldon Adelson wants John Bolton to threaten Iran. Trump and the GOP's biggest donor may now have installed their man. As a result, the likelihood of a new U.S. war of choice in the Middle East has risen dramatically.
He does not want to be somebody who gets into foreign incursions that we don't need to.
Wait a minute, we don't actually know what Trump wants because you cannot rely on what he has said. He repeatedly said correctly that Obama had no right to bomb Syria without congressional authorization, but then he turns around and bombs Syria without congressional authorization. There's no reason to trust anything Trump says. Bolton has no regard for morality or principles. He only cares about money and power. Bolton's entire career has been about serving powerful interests with no regard for ethics. An example of how underhanded Bolton is that he would go behind the backs of American officials and work against official U.S. policy in order to serve the interests of Israel. This is according to Danny Gillerman, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN. Look, many times he would call me or ask me to come and meet him, and for all intents and purposes would direct fire on his own forces in order to advance the interests of Israel, in contradiction to American policy. At the very moment that Powell was saying administration policy was not to attack Iran, Bolton was working with the Israelis to lay the groundwork for just such a war. And he angered State Department officials because he would be violating State Department protocol to have private meetings in Israel. To put it bluntly, Bolton cannot be trusted to serve the interests of the United States. Is an example where Bolton was visiting with Republican megadonor Sheldon Adelson. The most threatening line in Trump's UN speech came directly from Bolton. Bolton's been carrying out Adelson's agenda. For those that thought that Trump would keep Bolton in check, look at this. Trump reportedly seeks Adelson's advice amid differences with Bolton.
And I'd like to now ask the military aide to come forward and read the citations for each recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Miriam Adelson.
Keep in mind Sheldon Adelson's priorities.
All we care about is being good Zionists, being good citizens of Israel, because even though I'm not Israeli born, Israel is in my heart. I am not Israeli. The uniform that I wore in the military, unfortunately, was not an Israeli uniform. It was an American uniform. 4 of my 5 children are all Israeli. And I guess the one who's being bar mitzvahed will volunteer to be a sniper. He's a gun freak. Either that or he'll fly their predators.
Keep in mind Sheldon Adelson's agenda.
What do you mean support negotiation? What are we going to negotiate about? What I would say is
Listen, you see that desert out there? I want to show you something. So you pick up your cell phone and you call somewhere in Nebraska and you say, okay, let it go. So there's an atomic weapon goes over ballistic missiles in the middle of the desert that doesn't hurt a soul. And then you say, see, the next one is in the middle of Tehran.
Sheldon Adelson's a thug just like John Bolton. They're thugs putting us at risk of another war in the Middle East.
It is almost impossible to imagine that after the horror of the war in Iraq, when we were lied to by the Bush administration, and one of the leading architects of that war, by the way, was this very same John Bolton, who remains one of the few people in the world who actually thinks today that the war in Iraq was a good idea.
The newspaper owned by one of President Trump's and the Republican Party's biggest financial backers posting an editorial today signaling that President Trump should move on and accept that he did not win the election. Casino magnate Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Review-Journal editorial page writes, quote, the president does a disservice to his more rabid supporters by insisting that he would have won the November 3rd election absent voter fraud. That is simply false. There is no evidence, however, that fraud cost Mr. Trump the election.
He is not a guy that just goes down the line. And, you know, to be honest, it's reflective, I think, of a lot of what a lot of people are saying outside real core supporters of the president. Republicans right now, particularly the donor class, they're saying, like, enough's enough. Newspaper owner, I believe he owns the Oakland Raiders as well. I mean, Sheldon Adelson is a self-made man. He's a billionaire. I've been covering him for years, particularly his political contributions to Republicans. He's probably the most reliable bundler that or campaign contributor, a billionaire that the Republicans have.
Here we are on this merry-go-round about you have people under your supervision, but they're not under your control, under circumstances that would require very close scrutiny and supervision. This is an issue of major U.S. policy.
No, the preparation of a fact sheet, Congressman, is not a major issue of U.S. policy. This was a staff-level function done
when we're making a decision whether or not to go to war because a foreign country, because Iraq is trying to acquire nuclear weapons, that is a major issue. That is a major issue.
Mr. Van Hollen, this was not a policy issue of any significance. It was the preparation of a fact sheet to hand to the press about the Iraqi declaration of their weapons.
They were trying to persuade the Congress to approve the War Powers Act. That's what this is about.
I first met John Bolton 25 years ago. We were on opposite sides of a public debate on the question of the nature of the United Nations.
There is no United Nations. There is an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, and that's the United States, when it suits our interest and when we can get others to go along. The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
His role has not been that of somebody who just was a pundit who wrote editorials supporting the war in Iraq, for instance. He was actually helping to have it happen. And one of the things that was the responsibility of John Bolton was to orchestrate the ouster of Jose Bustani. This is when Iraq was talking about wanting to join the chemical weapons treaty. To do that, he would have had to submit the whole country to massively intrusive inspections. That was not in Washington's interest, because it would have proved that there were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction. So the work went on, led by John Bolton, to get him out.
I got a phone call from John Bolton from Washington to tell me that I should resign from the organization, and I asked him why. He said, your management style is not agreeable to Washington. I said, no way. So he came to The Hague, and he came to my office, and he said, you have to resign, and I give you 24 hours. And I said, no way, I don't have any reason to do that. I was elected by all the member states of the organization. It's only you, the United States, they are challenging my management style. And he said, we have already discussed with your government that you should resign. I said, I don't know of any agreement with my government. And then he said, okay, so there will be retaliations. Prepare to accept the consequences. We know where your kids are. And that moment, two of my kids were in New York. They studied in the United States. One of them is American, for that matter, was born in New York. He's a Brazilian American. And I had another daughter in London. And I said, I'm prepared. My family is aware of what's going on, so it's prepared to face the consequences. So go ahead. And he was a little bit shocked with that, and he left. He's not a man you can have a dialogue with.
When he refused to step down, Bolton orchestrated a move to vote him out. It had never happened before. He was voted out and replaced by someone who would respond to the U.S. need to keep the inspectors out of Iraq. So he played a very key role in setting the stage very directly for the Iraq War.